The barista's words hit me like ice water. Eleanor, don't sign anything today. Marcus has been meeting with lawyers about having you declared incompetent. I stared at my son through the coffee shop window, watching him pace on his phone, and felt something inside me crack. Not break, crack. Like the first hairline fracture before an avalanche. He thought I was too old, too trusting, too weak to fight back. He was wrong. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. What Marcus didn't know was that 40 years in real estate had taught me exactly how to destroy someone who underestimated me. Standing there in that coffee shop doorway watching my son through the window, I couldn't help but think about how we'd gotten here. You see, it wasn't always like this between us. There was a time when Marcus would call me just to hear my voice, when he'd bring his friends around because he was proud to introduce them to his mom. That feels like a lifetime ago now. I built my real estate empire from nothing, you know? Started with a single duplex I bought with my divorce settlement money back in 1985. My ex-husband Richard thought I was crazy, told me I'd lose everything within 6 months. He was still bitter that I'd walked away from our 23-year marriage with my dignity intact and half of everything we'd built together. But I knew something he didn't. I knew what it felt like to be underestimated, and I'd learned to use that to my advantage. Those early days were brutal. I'd drive around neighborhoods at dawn looking for sale by owner signs, learning to spot the desperation in sellers' eyes. I discovered that people saw a middle-aged divorced woman and assumed I was either desperate or naive. They were wrong on both counts. I was methodical. I was patient. And I was absolutely ruthless when it came to protecting what was mine. Marcus was 16 when I bought my first commercial property, a small strip mall that everyone said was in a dying part of town. He used to complain that I worked too much, that other kids' moms were home making cookies, while I was out showing properties or negotiating deals. I told him then that everything I was doing was for his future, for his security. I wanted him to never have to depend on anyone the way I'd depended on his father. Maybe that was my first mistake. By the time Marcus graduated high school, I owned 12 rental properties, and that strip mall had tripled in value thanks to the new shopping center they built 2 miles away. I put him through college without a single student loan, bought him his first car, his first apartment, helped with the down payment on his house. I thought I was being a good mother. I thought I was giving him the foundation I never had. The changes started slowly after his father died 3 years ago. Richard had been out of our lives for decades, but apparently he'd left Marcus a letter. I never knew what it said, but something shifted in my son after that. He started asking more questions about my finances, suggesting I was getting too old to manage my properties alone. At first, I thought it was sweet that he was concerned about me. I remember the first time he used the word burden. We were having dinner at his house, and I'd mentioned that one of my tenants was late with rent again. Marcus set down his fork and looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before, like I was a child who couldn't understand simple concepts. He said managing all those properties was becoming too much of a burden for someone my age, that maybe it was time to think about simplifying my life. The word hung in the air between us like smoke. Burden. As if the empire I'd built with my own two hands, the security I'd created not just for myself but for him, was somehow now an inconvenience. That's when the suggestions started. Maybe I should consider selling a few properties. Maybe I should think about moving somewhere smaller, somewhere with less maintenance. Maybe I should add his name to my accounts. Just in case something happened. For my own protection, he'd say. For peace of mind. I started noticing other things too. How he'd grown impatient when I took my time reading documents. How he'd answer questions directed at me when we met with my accountant. How he'd started referring to my properties as family assets instead of mom's properties. Small things, but they added up like drops of water eventually wearing away stone. The real wake-up call came 6 months ago when I had that dizzy spell at the grocery store. Nothing serious. I just stood up too quickly and felt lightheaded for a moment. But the store manager insisted on calling an ambulance. And somehow Marcus was there before the paramedics had even finished checking my blood pressure. Later, I found out he'd listed himself as my emergency contact without asking me. That night in the hospital, as they ran tests that all came back normal, Marcus sat beside my bed talking about how this was exactly what he'd been worried about, how I was getting to an age where these little episodes could turn into something serious, how we needed to be prepared, how it might be time to make some difficult decisions about my independence. The doctors released me the next morning with a clean bill of health and instructions to stay hydrated. But Marcus had already started making calls. I overheard him in the hallway talking to someone about power of attorney forms, about the importance of acting before a situation became an emergency. That's when I realized my son wasn't worried about my health. He was worried about my money. The past few months have been a careful dance between us. Him pushing harder for control, me appearing to gradually give in while actually paying closer attention than I ever had before. I started noticing discrepancies in my bank statements, small transfers I hadn't authorized. I found business cards for elder law attorneys in his jacket pocket when I was hanging up his coat. I discovered he'd been calling my property management company, asking detailed questions about rental income and maintenance costs. Each discovery felt like a paper cut. Small, sharp, but not immediately dangerous. Until today, when I finally understood that all those paper cuts had been planned. Marcus hadn't just been preparing to take over my finances, he'd been preparing to take over my life. Standing there in that coffee shop, listening to my old friend Sarah whisper her warning about incompetency proceedings, I felt something I hadn't felt since my divorce 40 years ago. That cold, clarifying anger that comes when you realize someone you trusted has been systematically betraying you. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't a desperate housewife with limited options. This time, I had resources, I had experience, and I had absolutely nothing left to lose. As I watched Marcus through the window, still pacing, still talking on his phone, probably to his lawyer, I made a decision that would change everything between us. I was done being the trusting mother. It was time to remind my son exactly who he was dealing with. The walk from that coffee shop to the bank felt like the longest 100 yards of my life, but with each step I felt myself transforming back into the woman who'd built an empire from a divorce settlement and sheer determination. Marcus caught up to me just as I reached the bank's entrance, slightly out of breath and trying to hide his irritation at having to cut his phone call short. He held the door open with that practiced smile he'd perfected over the years, the one that said he was being patient with his elderly mother who moved too slowly for his busy schedule. Inside the bank, everything felt different than it had during my previous visits. The marble floors that had once seemed elegant now felt cold under my feet. The teller, who usually greeted me warmly, seemed to avoid eye contact. Even the air conditioning felt more aggressive, as if the building itself was trying to push me out. But what struck me most was how Marcus moved through that space. He walked ahead of me toward the private banking office, not beside me like a supportive son, but in front of me like someone who belonged there more than I did. He knew exactly where we were going, which told me this wasn't his first visit to discuss my accounts.
I didn't have to explain much. Tatcha had been expecting my call. She'd seen the signs before I'd even recognized them myself. The way Marcus had started inserting himself into conversations about my estate, the questions he'd been asking about my mental competency, the sudden interest in my daily routines and social interactions. Tatcha had already been quietly documenting everything, just in case. She'd recorded the conversations Marcus had tried to have with her about my capacity to make financial decisions. She'd kept copies of the emails he'd sent asking about procedures for obtaining guardianship over elderly parents. She'd even noted the dates when he'd called her office fishing for information about my assets and estate planning. What Tatcha told me that afternoon changed everything. She explained that what Marcus had done at the bank was just the opening move in a much larger strategy. The joint accounts and power of attorney documents were designed to create a paper trail showing that I'd voluntarily given up control of my finances due to age-related confusion. The next step would be medical evaluations that would support claims about my diminished capacity. Then would come the formal competency hearing where Marcus would reluctantly request guardianship over his poor, declining mother. The timeline she laid out was chilling in its precision. Marcus had apparently been researching this process for months, maybe even longer. He'd identified the right doctors, the right legal procedures, even the right witnesses who could testify about my supposed confusion and memory issues. This wasn't a son worried about his mother's welfare. This was a businessman executing a carefully planned acquisition. But Tatcha also explained something that gave me hope. Marcus's plan had a fatal flaw. He'd assumed I was exactly what I appeared to be, a lonely old woman with more money than sense, someone who'd be grateful for his attention and guidance. He never considered that I might be aware of what he was doing, much less prepared to fight back. That's when Tatcha told me about the investigators she'd hired. Professional, discreet people who'd been watching Marcus for weeks, documenting his meetings with lawyers and doctors, tracking his research into elder law, even recording some of his phone conversations about my supposed incompetence. Everything he'd done to build his case against me had been documented and could be used as evidence of financial elder abuse. The irony was perfect. While Marcus had been gathering evidence to prove I was too confused to manage my own affairs, I'd been gathering evidence to prove he was a calculating predator who'd been manipulating his elderly mother for financial gain. But the most satisfying revelation came when Tatcha showed me the financial analysis her team had prepared. They'd tracked every suspicious transaction, every unusual transfer, every discrepancy in my accounts over the past year. Marcus hadn't just been planning to take control of my money, he'd already been stealing it, small amounts at a time, probably testing to see if I'd notice. The total wasn't huge by my standards, maybe $15,000 over 8 months, but it was enough to prove intent. It was enough to show a pattern of financial abuse that had been going on long before today's bank visit. Most importantly, it was enough to destroy his credibility completely if this ever went to court. As I sat in my office that evening, surrounded by documents and evidence and the tools of war I'd spent decades collecting, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my divorce settlement was finalized. I felt powerful. Not because I had money or property or legal weapons, but because I had clarity. I knew exactly who Marcus really was now, and I knew exactly how to destroy him. The next few weeks were going to require the performance of my lifetime. I'd need to convince Marcus that his plan was working perfectly while I systematically dismantled everything he'd built. The first test came sooner than I expected. 3 days after our bank visit, Marcus showed up at my house, unannounced, with takeout from my favorite Chinese restaurant. He said he'd been thinking about me, wondering how I was adjusting to all the changes we'd made. But I could see the real reason for his visit in the way his eyes swept over my living room, taking inventory, assessing the value of things he now considered partially his. I played the role he expected perfectly. I seemed grateful for his visit, maybe a little lonely, definitely overwhelmed by the complexity of my new financial arrangements. I even made a few innocent mistakes when he asked about my day, mixing up names of neighbors, forgetting what day of the week it was. Small things that would seem like normal aging to anyone else, but I could see Marcus filing them away as evidence of my declining mental state. What Marcus couldn't see was that every confused moment was calculated. Every grateful smile was an act of war. While he was cataloging my supposed confusion, I was studying him with the kind of attention I used to reserve for difficult negotiations. I was learning his tells, the way his jaw tightened when he thought he was being clever, the way his voice got softer when he was manipulating me, the way he checked his phone obsessively, probably coordinating with lawyers or doctors about the next phase of his plan. The most revealing moment came when he offered to help me organize my home office. He said it was such casual concern, suggesting that all those old files and documents were probably just cluttering up my space now that he was handling my important business. What he really wanted was access to my records, to understand exactly what assets he hadn't discovered yet, to make sure there weren't any surprises waiting for him. I let him think about it for a moment, then politely declined, explaining that going through all those old papers would probably just upset me. I'd rather leave that kind of thing until later, when I felt stronger. Marcus's smile when I said that was the most genuine expression I'd seen from him in months. He thought I was protecting him from the burden of dealing with my messy financial history. What he didn't realize was that I was protecting myself from letting him see the evidence I was gathering against him. Over the following days, I established a routine that made Marcus feel secure while giving me the freedom I needed to work with Tatcha and her team. I started having what I called senior moments, times when I seemed confused or tired and needed to rest. These episodes always happened when Marcus was around, reinforcing his narrative about my declining capacity. But they also gave me excuses to end conversations when he was fishing for information or to avoid activities where I might accidentally reveal how sharp my mind really was. The beauty of this strategy was that it made Marcus more confident, which made him more careless. He stopped being so careful about hiding his true intentions. He started making assumptions about what I did and didn't understand. Most importantly, he started underestimating my ability to notice things. That's how I discovered he'd been going through my mail. It started with small things, envelopes that had been opened slightly differently than I remembered, letters that seemed to have been refolded incorrectly. Then I noticed that certain pieces of mail weren't arriving when they should have been. Bank statements, insurance papers, correspondence from my property management company. All the kinds of documents that would give Marcus a complete picture of my financial situation. So I set a trap. I asked Tatcha to send me a fake legal document, something that looked official but was actually meaningless, a letter about a supposed property dispute that mentioned significant assets Marcus didn't know about. I made sure to leave it prominently displayed on my kitchen counter where he'd be sure to see it during one of his increasingly frequent visits. The next time Marcus came over, I watched him from my bedroom window as he stood in my kitchen photographing that document with his phone. He thought he was being so clever, documenting evidence of assets he could eventually claim. What he was actually doing was creating evidence of his own crimes, proof that he was illegally accessing my private correspondence and gathering intelligence for his financial manipulation scheme. But the most damaging evidence came from Marcus himself, during what he probably thought was his most compassionate moment. He'd started bringing me groceries every week, ostensibly because he was worried about me driving. Really, it was another way to monitor my activities and reinforce the idea that I was becoming dependent on his care. During one of these grocery runs, Marcus suggested we stop by his house so I could see some renovations he'd been doing. I hadn't been to his place in months, and I was curious about these improvements he could suddenly afford on his mid-level corporate salary. What I found there told me everything I needed to know about where my missing money had been going. Marcus had completely remodeled his kitchen with top-of-the-line appliances that cost more than most people make in a year. His living room had been furnished with pieces I recognized from the exclusive dealers I'd use when decorating my own investment properties. His garage housed a new luxury car that he'd somehow forgotten to mention purchasing. Most telling of all was the home office he'd set up in what used to be his guest bedroom. It was equipped like a command center, multiple monitors, high-end computer equipment, filing cabinets full of documents. When I complimented him on his setup, he explained with obvious pride how he'd been learning about estate planning and elder care law. He wanted to be prepared to help me navigate all the complex decisions that were coming as I got older. What he'd actually created was a headquarters for managing his systematic theft of my assets and his campaign to have me declared incompetent. I could see portions of documents spread across his desk, legal forms, medical evaluations, financial analyses, all focused on building the case that Eleanor Davis was no longer capable of managing her own affairs. The final piece of evidence I needed came when Marcus excused himself to take a phone call, leaving me alone in that office for just a few minutes. That's when I saw the notebook he'd been using to track my behavior. Page after page of observations about my supposed confusion, my forgetfulness, my apparent inability to handle complex information, dates and times when I'd seemed disoriented or made mistakes, a detailed log of my decline written in his careful handwriting. But what made my blood run cold was the section labeled Timeline. Marcus had mapped out the next 6 months with military precision. Doctor appointments that would document my cognitive issues, legal consultations that would establish the framework for guardianship, financial moves that would consolidate my assets under his control, even a preliminary discussion about selling my house and moving me into a care facility. My son hadn't just been stealing my money, he'd been planning to steal my entire life. Standing in that office, looking at the evidence of Marcus's systematic betrayal, I felt something shift inside me that I'd never experienced before. This wasn't just anger or hurt or disappointment. This was a cold, crystalline fury that clarified everything. Marcus had declared war on me, and he'd made the fatal mistake of assuming I was too weak to fight back. But as I carefully memorized every detail of what I'd seen, as I prepared to leave his house with my mask of grateful confusion firmly in place, I realized something that filled me with satisfaction I hadn't felt in years. Marcus had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He'd shown me his entire operation, revealed every aspect of his strategy, and handed me the weapons I needed to destroy him completely, all because he was so convinced of my helplessness that he couldn't imagine I was capable of turning his own evidence against him. The drive home from his house was the longest 20 minutes I had experienced since that day at the bank. I had to maintain my performance, the slightly overwhelmed mother who was grateful for her son's attention but tired from the outing. But inside, my mind was racing with possibilities. Every piece of evidence I'd seen, every document on his desk, every luxury item he'd purchased with my stolen money, it all painted a picture that would be devastating in the right hands. That evening, I called Tatcha with details that made even her seasoned legal mind pause. The notebook documenting my supposed decline was particularly damaging because it showed premeditation. Marcus hadn't just been taking advantage of opportunities as they arose, he'd been systematically creating those opportunities. The timeline he'd laid out proved he'd been planning this campaign for months, maybe longer. But Tatcha also warned me about something I hadn't fully considered. Marcus's evidence gathering worked both ways. If he was documenting my behavior to support claims of incompetence, then any dramatic change in my actions could undermine the case we were building against him. I needed to continue appearing vulnerable while we prepared our counterattack, which meant living with his manipulation a little longer. The hardest part was the waiting. Every day that passed was another day Marcus felt more secure in his scheme, more confident that his confused mother was settling into her new reality. He started visiting even more frequently, always with some excuse about checking on me or helping with something I supposedly couldn't handle alone. Each visit was a performance where I had to appear grateful for his concern while documenting every lie he told, every manipulation he attempted. The breaking point came when Marcus suggested it might be time for me to consider signing a will that reflected my new circumstances. He'd been doing research, he said, about estate planning for people in my situation, people who were starting to experience some confusion and wanted to make sure their wishes were clear before things got more complicated. What he was really doing was trying to manipulate me into leaving him everything while I was still legally competent to do so. It would be the perfect crime, a devoted son helping his declining mother make responsible decisions about her legacy. No messy competency hearings, no contested guardianships, just a grateful elderly woman ensuring her assets went to the child who had been taking such good care of her. That's when I knew our waiting period was over. Marcus was ready to make his final move, which meant it was time for me to make mine. The war that had been simmering beneath the surface was about to become very real and very public. Tatcha and I spent the next 3 days finalizing our strategy. Every piece of evidence we'd gathered, every document we'd discovered, every recording we'd made, it all had to be organized into a presentation that would leave no doubt about Marcus's true intentions. But timing was everything. We needed Marcus to commit fully to his scheme before we revealed our hand. The perfect opportunity came when Marcus called to schedule what he described as a family meeting. He wanted to bring his attorney and a financial advisor to my house to discuss my estate planning needs. He was being so thoughtful, he said, making sure I had professional guidance to help me understand all the options available to someone in my position. What he was really doing was setting up the final scene of his performance. He wanted witnesses present when his declining mother made the decision to leave everything to his devoted son. Professional witnesses who could later testify that Eleanor Davis had seemed confused but grateful, that she clearly needed guidance, and that her son had been nothing but supportive and protective throughout the process. I agreed to the meeting with the kind of hesitant acceptance Marcus had come to expect from me. I seemed overwhelmed by the idea of dealing with such complicated matters, but grateful that he was there to help me navigate them. I even suggested that maybe he should handle most of the discussion, since these financial and legal concepts were so hard for me to follow. Marcus's satisfaction was almost palpable. He thought he'd maneuvered me into the perfect position, confused enough to need his guidance, but competent enough to legally sign documents. His plan was flawless, except for one crucial miscalculation. He assumed he was the only one who understood the importance of having witnesses present for important legal discussions. What Marcus didn't know was that Tatcha had arranged for her own team to be in position that day. A court reporter who would document every word spoken, a private investigator with recording equipment who would capture every gesture and expression, medical experts who would evaluate my mental state in real time and document that I showed no signs of cognitive impairment. Most importantly, she'd arranged for Detective Sarah Chin from the Financial Crimes Unit to be present, not as a participant in the meeting, but as a witness to what we both suspected would amount to a confession of financial elder abuse. The morning of the meeting, I felt calmer than I had in months, not because I knew I was going to win. There are never guarantees in situations like this, but because I was finally going to stop pretending. After weeks of playing the confused, grateful mother, I was going to show Marcus exactly who he'd been underestimating. Marcus arrived at my house an hour early, which told me he was nervous despite his confident facade. He wanted time to coach me before his team arrived to make sure I understood what we'd be discussing and how I should respond. What he called preparation, I recognized as manipulation, one final attempt to ensure I'd play the role he'd written for me. I let him fuss over the arrangement of my living room, moving chairs to create what he probably thought was a more formal setting. I watched him check his briefcase multiple times, organizing documents in the exact order he'd need them. Most revealing of all, I noticed him practicing his concerned son expression in my hallway mirror when he thought I wasn't looking.
When his attorney arrived, a sharp-dressed man named Robert Sterling who specialized in elder law, I could see Marcus's confidence surge. Sterling had clearly been briefed on my supposed condition because he spoke to me with that particular tone people use when they think you're not quite capable of following complex conversations. Slow, clear words, accompanied by patronizing smiles and gentle nods of encouragement. The financial advisor was even worse. Jennifer Walls treated me like a confused child who needed simple concepts explained multiple times. She'd brought colorful charts and diagrams that she said would help me understand my options better. The condescension was so thick I could have cut it with a knife, but I absorbed every bit of it because each patronizing comment was evidence of the conspiracy Marcus had organized against me. What none of them realized was that while they were setting up their performance, I was conducting my own surveillance. Every glance they exchanged, every confident smile, every assumption they made about my mental state, I was cataloging it all. These people had come to my home to participate in what they believed was illegal but morally questionable manipulation of an elderly woman, and they were about to discover they'd walked into a trap. The meeting began exactly as Marcus had rehearsed it. Sterling explained that they were there to help me make important decisions about my future while I was still able to do so. Walsh spread out her charts showing different estate planning scenarios, all of which coincidentally resulted in Marcus having immediate access to my assets. They spoke about me as if I wasn't there, discussing my capacity and my needs and my best interests with the casual confidence of people who'd done this many times before. But what struck me most was how Marcus had changed during this performance. Gone was any pretense of the loving son who was reluctantly taking on the burden of caring for his aging mother. In front of his professional team, he was all business, pointing out specific assets, discussing liquidation strategies, even mentioning potential tax advantages of moving quickly before my condition deteriorated further. That's when I realized Marcus wasn't just stealing my money, he was treating me like a business acquisition. He'd studied my assets the way a corporate raider studies a takeover target. He'd identified my weaknesses, neutralized my defenses, and brought in specialists to execute a clean, legal extraction of everything I'd built. The moment that crystallized everything for me was when Sterling began explaining the power of attorney documents I'd supposedly need to sign to protect myself from future confusion. He laid out scenarios where I might make poor financial decisions due to my declining mental state, situations where I might be vulnerable to scams or manipulation from strangers who would take advantage of my condition. The irony was stunning. Here was a room full of people who were actively manipulating and taking advantage of what they believed was my diminished mental state, warning me about the dangers of manipulation and financial abuse from others. That's when I decided it was time to show them who they were really dealing with. I started by asking a few questions that weren't quite as simple as they expected. Technical questions about estate tax implications that someone with genuine cognitive issues wouldn't think to ask. Specific inquiries about asset protection strategies that revealed I understood exactly what they were proposing and why. I could see confusion starting to creep into their expressions as I demonstrated knowledge they hadn't expected me to possess. Sterling began speaking more carefully, less condescendingly. Walsh stopped using her simple charts and started addressing me more directly. Most tellingly, Marcus began looking uncomfortable as his carefully crafted narrative about his confused mother started falling apart. But the real shift came when I asked to see the documentation Tatcha had been preparing, the evidence we'd been gathering about Marcus's activities over the past several months. I explained calmly that before I signed any documents transferring control of my assets, I wanted to understand exactly how those assets had been managed recently. The silence in the room was deafening as I spread out bank statements showing the unauthorized transfers Marcus had made, financial records documenting purchases he'd made with money that wasn't his, photographs of the luxury items he'd bought while telling me he was concerned about my financial security. Sterling was the first to understand what was happening. His face went white as he realized he'd walked into what was essentially a confession session for financial elder abuse. Walsh quickly began gathering her papers, clearly wanting to distance herself from whatever was about to unfold. But Marcus? Marcus just sat there staring at the evidence I'd laid out, his confident facade crumbling as he realized the trap he'd walked into. This wasn't his confused mother having a moment of unexpected clarity. This was a calculated revelation by someone who'd been playing him from the beginning. The most satisfying moment was when I pulled out the notebook, his notebook, the one where he documented my supposed decline and mapped out his timeline for taking control of my life. I'd photographed every page during my visit to his house, and now I read from his own handwriting as I described his systematic campaign to have me declared incompetent. As the full scope of what Marcus had been planning became clear to everyone in the room, I watched him transform from confident manipulator to cornered animal. He tried to explain, to justify, to somehow spin this as concern for my welfare rather than calculated theft. But the evidence was overwhelming, and his own documentation of his scheme made denial impossible. That's when Detective Chen stepped out from where she'd been quietly observing from my kitchen, her badge clearly visible as she approached our little gathering. The look of absolute shock on Marcus's face when he realized this had all been planned, that I'd known exactly what he was doing and had been gathering evidence against him for weeks, was something I'll treasure for the rest of my life. Watching my son, the boy I'd sacrificed everything for, the man I trusted with my financial security, the person who'd systematically betrayed me while pretending to care about my welfare, finally understand that his mother had outmaneuvered him completely. The aftermath of that revelation was swift and devastating for Marcus. Sterling and Walsh couldn't leave my house fast enough, their professional reputations now tied to what was clearly going to become a criminal investigation. I almost felt sorry for them. They probably thought they were just helping a concerned son manage his declining mother's affairs, not realizing they'd been recruited as accessories to financial elder abuse. But Marcus couldn't run. He sat frozen in my living room chair as Detective Chen explained his rights and the charges he'd be facing: financial exploitation of an elderly person, fraud, identity theft for accessing my accounts without authorization. Each charge carried serious prison time, but more than that, each one stripped away another layer of the life he'd built with my stolen money. The most devastating moment for Marcus came when Detective Chen explained how the investigation would proceed. All those luxury purchases he'd made would need to be documented and potentially seized as evidence. His house, with all those expensive renovations, would be scrutinized as potential proceeds of crime. Even his job could be at risk once his employer learned about the charges. Everything Marcus had gained through his manipulation was about to be taken away, and the irony wasn't lost on either one of us. He tried to steal my independence, my dignity, my life's work, and in the process, he destroyed his own life completely. But what hurt Nurst most at watching his world collapse, it was seeing, finally, who my son really was underneath all the manipulation. As the reality of his situation sunk in, Marcus didn't show remorse for what he'd done to me. He didn't apologize for the betrayal or express regret for the pain he had caused. Instead, he was angry. Angry that I'd discovered his scheme, angry that I'd fought back, angry that his carefully planned theft hadn't worked. In those final moments before Detective Chen escorted him from my house, Marcus looked at me with pure resentment. Not the shame of a son who'd betrayed his mother's trust, but the fury of a criminal who'd been caught by someone he'd underestimated. It was the look that told me everything I needed to know about who Marcus had become, or maybe who he'd always been, hidden beneath the facade of the caring son. After everyone left, I found myself alone in my living room, surrounded by the scattered papers and evidence that had just destroyed my relationship with my only child forever. The silence in my house felt different than it had for months, not the oppressive quiet of isolation and betrayal, but the peaceful calm of a war finally ended.
Tatcha called within the hour to tell me how proud she was of what I'd accomplished, but also to prepare me for what came next. The legal proceedings would be lengthy and public. Marcus would likely try to paint me as a vindictive mother who'd orchestrated this entire situation out of spite or confusion. The media attention could be intense, especially given the amounts of money involved. But as I listened to her outline the challenges ahead, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't afraid of the fight anymore. For months, I had been living in fear. Fear of Marcus's manipulation, fear of losing my independence, fear of being seen as a helpless old woman who couldn't protect herself. Now, sitting in my house with my freedom restored and my dignity intact, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt proud of myself. The legal proceedings that followed were everything Tatcha had warned me they'd be: lengthy, complicated, and occasionally absurd. Marcus hired an expensive defense attorney who tried every trick in the book to paint me as either a confused old woman who'd misunderstood her son's good intentions or a vindictive mother orchestrating an elaborate revenge scheme. The funniest moment came during Marcus's attorney's opening statement, when he suggested that my ability to gather evidence and plan a counterattack was itself proof that I was too mentally sharp to be a victim of elder abuse. Apparently, I was simultaneously too confused to manage my own finances and too clever to be manipulated. Even the judge looked confused by that particular piece of legal logic. But the most satisfying part of the trial was watching Marcus try to explain away his notebook, the one where he documented my supposed decline in his own handwriting. His lawyer attempted to argue that it was simply a concerned son keeping track of my mother's health issues.
Unfortunately for Marcus, it's hard to claim concern for someone's well being when you've also written detailed plans about liquidating their assets and moving them into a nursing home against their will. The prosecution had a field day with that notebook. They read from it like it was a criminal instruction manual, which in many ways it was. Marcus had been so methodical in documenting his scheme that he'd essentially written a confession without realizing it. As my late ex husband used to say, the devil is in the details, and Marcus had provided plenty of devilish details. The trial lasted 6 weeks, and I attended every single day, not because I had to, but because I wanted Marcus to see me there, sharp as ever, completely in control of my faculties and my life. I wanted him to understand that the confused, helpless mother he'd been manipulating was as much of a performance as his caring son routine had been. When the guilty verdict came in on all charges, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief, certainly, vindication, absolutely, but also a deep sadness for the relationship that had been destroyed and the son I'd apparently never really known. Marcus received 3 years in prison and was ordered to pay back every penny he'd stolen, plus damages. The judge was particularly harsh about the breach of trust involved, pointing out that crimes against elderly family members strike at the foundation of how we care for our most vulnerable citizens. But here's what nobody expected, including me. Marcus's conviction became something of a local sensation. Apparently, stories about elderly people fighting back against financial abuse don't happen often enough, and the media loved the narrative of the sharp grandmother who'd outsmarted her scheming son. I started getting calls from other seniors who suspected they were being manipulated by family members, adult children who were worried about their parents' finances but didn't know how to help, even lawyers who wanted advice on how to spot the warning signs of elder abuse. That's when I realized this whole nightmare had given me something I hadn't expected, a purpose I'd been missing since I retired from real estate. 6 months after Marcus's sentencing, I did something that would have shocked everyone who knew the quiet, private person I used to be. I started giving talks about financial elder abuse, not as a victim, but as someone who'd fought back and won. I spoke at community centers, senior living facilities, even law schools about the warning signs and the strategies predators use. The most popular part of my presentations was always the section I called The Art of Playing Possum. I'd explain how pretending to be confused or helpless could actually be a powerful tool for gathering evidence against someone who was trying to manipulate you. Audiences loved hearing about how I'd used Marcus's own assumptions about my mental state to trap him into revealing his entire scheme. I also started working with Tatcha to help other families navigate similar situations. We developed what we jokingly called the Eleanor Protocol, a step-by-step guide for elderly people who suspect they're being financially abused by family members. The key we discovered was documentation. Everything had to be recorded, photographed, or witnessed. Predators rely on the fact that their victims often can't prove what's been done to them. The irony of my new career wasn't lost on me. Marcus had tried to steal my independence and ended up giving me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. His betrayal had forced me to rediscover strengths I'd forgotten I possessed and to use those strengths to help others in similar situations. About a year after the trial, I received a letter from Marcus in prison. It was the first communication we'd had since that day in my living room when Detective Chen led him away in handcuffs. I debated for weeks whether to open it, finally deciding that closure required understanding, even if forgiveness was still beyond my reach. The letter was shorter than I'd expected and more honest than I'd hoped. Marcus didn't try to justify what he'd done or blame his actions on desperation or bad influences. He simply acknowledged that he'd betrayed my trust in the worst possible way and that he understood why I'd felt compelled to fight back. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He said he knew he didn't deserve it, but he wanted me to know that prison had given him time to understand the person he'd become and to regret the choices that had brought him there. Reading that letter in my kitchen on a quiet Tuesday morning, I felt something shift in my chest that I hadn't expected. Not forgiveness, that would take much longer if it ever came at all, but a kind of peace with the situation. Marcus was facing the consequences of his actions. I had reclaimed my life and found new purpose in helping others, and the world was a slightly safer place for other elderly people who might face similar betrayals. That evening, as I sat in my garden watching the sunset over the property I'd fought so hard to keep, I reflected on something my real estate mentor had told me 40 years ago during my first difficult negotiation. She had said that sometimes the most important battles aren't about winning or losing, they're about refusing to be dismissed or underestimated. I'd spent months being underestimated by my own son, but I'd refused to be dismissed. And in fighting back, I'd not only saved my own independence, but had found a way to help others protect theirs as well. These days, when people ask me for advice about dealing with family members who might be taking advantage of them, I tell them something that always gets a laugh. Never underestimate the power of a grandmother who's tired of being played for a fool. But then I get serious and remind them that knowledge is power, documentation is protection, and sometimes the best way to win a fight is to let your opponent think they've already won while you're gathering the ammunition to destroy them completely. After all, there's nothing quite like the element of surprise, especially when it comes from someone everyone assumes is too old, too trusting, or too confused to fight back. Trust me on this. I'm living proof. That assumption can be a very dangerous mistake.